Hello everyone. This week in the data track we are going to take a quick look at optimization. And optimization is actually a common problem. It's a common problem for many organizations and businesses. But we're going to look at a couple of specific examples. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch the Solver videos that preceded this one, and that will have given you an introduction to Solver and how it's used for optimization. What we're going to do is walk through it again, kind of the basics of Solver, and talk about what it is that Solver is looking for. And then I'm going to show you the example, which is your assignment. It's the first part of your assignment. It's how you set up the guns and butter spreadsheet. The second part of your assignment is going to be up to you to figure out on your own, but it shouldn't be too difficult once you've set up the initial spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and get started. So optimization, as if you've watched the videos, you've seen that optimization is very common for businesses. It's almost like a survival method for businesses. It's really, and it's works for other organizations too. It's not just for business, but it's really a lot of times we're asking how can we produce the most or make the most profit for the lowest cost. And when we're operating in an environment where our margins are very, very thin, maximizing profit and minimizing cost can be kind of almost essential to a business's survival. But the other thing we have to worry about when we're maximizing profit and lowering costs is we have to survive within certain constraints. And every company has constraints. It has constraints on the number of people that work there, the hours that they can contribute as far as labor. It has constraints on the materials. It has constraints on the money that they can spend on producing product. So we can't maximize our model if we don't respect our constraints. Let's take a look at a simple example. A lot of people are buying these packaged dinners where they'll sell you everything, kind of all the ingredients in a box, and all you do is throw it in a pan and cook it up, and it turns out to be like this gourmet meal that you didn't really have to work that hard at. But anyway, imagine that we are in that business, and so we are going to have to sell to a certain clientele, certain customers. You know, these are typically busy people who are willing to pay a premium dollar for packaged dinners. Okay? As a business, though, we have to have money to buy materials. We have to have people who work in our store, and we have to remember that they cost money too. We have a growing list of customers because our business is becoming successful. And some of our our products make good profit, and some just make small profit. You know, some of the meals, we can't really sell them for as much, so we don't make as much profit on them. Some of the meals, you know, really, really good meals, we can sell them and make quite a bit of profit on them. Okay. So our question is, when we're planning out, you know, maybe for the next 6 months or the next 12 months, what we're going to do as far as our strategy, we might want to know how do we maximize our profits. And we also have to work within our constraints. Our constraints are going to be how many people can we afford to hire, how much labor or how many labor hours can they contribute, are they full-time, part-time, what is the cost of our materials. We got to be able to buy our food, our boxes. We also have to be able to cover our costs for shipping, etc. And so all those kinds of things, those become our constraints. So we can maximize profits all we want, but if we go outside of our constraints, we'll be living in an unrealistic world. And the other thing we're going to want to try to do is we're going to try to maximize the sale of the high profit meals. So we'll sell more of them if we can than the low profit meals, because that will contribute more to our maximized profit. So like I said, our objective is maximize profit. Our decision variables is or are the number of each type of meal that we're going to sell. And then we have constraints. Our constraints are things like labor. We have only so many hours of labor that are available. And each type of meal takes a certain amount of time to produce. They're not all the same. Money, we have to pay for both for our food and our labor. And each type of meal costs a certain amount, right? So one meal type may cost X dollars. Another meal type might cost twice that much to produce. So our job is to produce and sell the highest number of high profit meals. But we also may need to sell lower profit ones too, and I'll go through that on the next slide. Why would we worry about lower profit ones? If we really were trying to maximize profits, why don't we just sell the high profit ones? Let's go back to the top of the slide. There are 3 things I want you to keep in mind. And if you've watched the earlier videos, then you probably already are familiar with these, but I want to just point them out again. There are 3 things that Solver needs. We're going to use Solver to actually maximize our profits. The first thing it needs is an objective, and that's the thing that it's maximizing, or if it's the other side, minimizing. So we'll feed it an objective variable. The second thing, in the second bullet point, are decision variables. And those are the things that we're going to change, the things that we're going to mess around with. In this particular case, it would be the number of each type of meal. So maybe we have 10 different meals that we sell, and the decision variables that we're going to mess around with or play around with to try to maximize our profits are going to be those 10 variables, which be the amount of each type of meal that we're going to sell. So we'll mess around with those and adjust those until we come up with a maximized profit. And then the third thing that Solver uses is constraints. And constraints are, living within our world or living within our means. There are things like how many labor hours do we have? And there are things like how much money do we have to be able to produce these meals? Or how much money do we have to be able to buy our materials? So we have to feed that in order for Solver to be able to give us a good model of what we're going to be able to do. So those three things are key. Objective, decision variables, and constraints are key in every optimization model, and you'll see them show up in many of the examples that we'll look at. So why, at the end of the last slide, I talked about maybe making a mix of high profit and low profit meals. So we'll see this in a lot of examples. It turns out that we can maximize profit better sometimes if we make a mix and don't focus just on the high profit stuff. So in this example, if the high profit meals take an hour to produce and cost $20 in materials and labor, we're just going to run out of available resources that much faster. And while the lower profit meals may yield less profit, a collection of them together that require fewer resources could actually help us maximize our profit even better. So it may be best for us to make a mix of high profit and lower profit meals, and that may be the best way to maximize the profit. So how do we know which mix to choose? Do we do it by trial and error? Well, we could do it by trial and error, and that's how they used to do it. But again, why do all that work when we have Solver that will do it all for us? So Solver, if you've watched the videos, you know this, but I'll go over it again. Solver is an add-in for Microsoft Excel, which means it doesn't come installed in Microsoft Excel. You have to go into the options and install it. And both of the previous videos should have shown you how to do that. It needs three things. In our spreadsheet that we set up, we have to identify what is the objective, and the objective is basically a variable in the spreadsheet. And so we'll go ahead and set that up and tell the Solver algorithm what the objective is. It needs to know what our decision variables are, and those are the things that are going to change each time. What Solver really does is it goes through our scenario that we feed it, and it puts new sets of numbers in over and over and over again until it finds the set of numbers that yields either the maximized profit or the minimized cost. So what it's doing is it's changing those decision variables. So in the first iteration, it may start with just a random collection of variables. Then it throws in the decision variables, and it tests it out to see what the result is. Then it remembers that result and goes to the second iteration, tests those numbers, and the third, and the fourth, and so on, until it's tested all viable options and determined which one maximized the profit. So that's really what gets changed, is those decision variables. And you'll see that in the example that we're going to look at. The constraints, of course, have to be respected, and so the decision variables can't go outside of the constraints. We can change the decision variables all we want, but they have to remain respectful of the constraints. Otherwise, we're not living with a realistic model. And constraints are really the limits of what we have, things like money, labor, materials. The model knows that we have to stay within certain parameters. So when we identify those three things, that is, objective, decision variables, and constraints, we can feed them into Solver. And Solver will search for the maximum or minimum by testing all viable solutions. So let's walk through an example. This is the example for your assignment. Okay? And the first thing we're going to do is just sort of set up the scenario. So this is called the guns and butter example. It's the optimization of guns and butter. And really, it goes back to kind of a scenario in World War II. And the year is 1941, and Jeremy, a Frenchman, is hiding behind enemy lines, and he's a secret agent hiding behind enemy lines. Okay? His secret goal is to build guns for the resistance. But his cover is as a dairy farmer, so he's actually existing behind enemy lines as a dairy farmer, and his job, his public job, or his known job, is to make and sell butter by the ton. Okay? But secretly at night, he produces guns for the resistance. Okay? He only gets so much money each month from the sale of his products. Both the guns and the butter bring him in so much money each month. So within that constraint, he can produce as many guns and as many tons of butter as he possibly can. He has to keep the farm going in order to keep his cover. So he can't just produce guns because they'll figure out that he is a secret agent and that will be the end of him. So he has to produce some amount of butter. It can't be zero. But he also has to make guns. That's kind of the point of why he's there. So he has to produce some of each product. So how does he make the most guns with the money he has while still producing butter to keep his cover? So let's talk about the objectives, decision variables, and constraints. Okay? The objective, of course, is maximizing profit. He has to maximize profit to keep his business going. So, and the way he's maximizing profit, if we break that down a little bit, he gets $195 for each gun and $150 for each ton of butter. Okay? So he's going to try to make the most money possible while still producing non-zero guns and non-zero tons of butter. Okay? The decision variables is what is the mix of guns and butter that need to be produced each month to maximize his profit. So we really have two decision variables there. The first decision variable is the number of guns, and the second decision variable is the number of tons of butter. Here are his constraints. It costs him $100 to produce a ton of butter and $150 to produce a gun. And he only has a budget of $1,800. So out of that $1,800, he's got to come up with a mix of guns and butter that will stay within that $1,800 limit, but yet still give him the maximized profit. The other constraint he has is that he only has one small cellar where he can store his products until his products can be moved to market. And so that cellar has 21 cubic meters of storage space. Each gun takes a half of a cubic meter to store, and each ton of butter takes 1.5 cubic meters to store. So no matter the mix, even if it's maximized profit, if the mix exceeds 21 cubic meters of needed space to store the product, it's an unrealistic solution, simply because he won't be able to store his products. So, and he has no other place to store either product. It's only in that cellar that he can store his stuff. So let's take a look at this in Excel. And we'll look at it here in the PowerPoint slide just to kind of show you how I've set it up. And then I'll go into Excel and show you the very specifics of how I've set it up. Because what your job is going to be as part of this assignment is to set up a spreadsheet that looks and works exactly like what I've told you, or what I'm about to show you. And then, of course, in the second part of the assignment, you'll make adjustments to what I'm showing you. Okay. So the first thing we're doing is we're setting up a variable called revenue. And revenue is what we're maximizing. So that becomes our objective. So we'll put a formula here. This is actually just a sample. But we'll put a formula here that will show you what your maximized profit is. Okay. So that's our objective. Now we're going to move down to our decision variables. Our decision variables, if you remember from the slides, there are two decision variables. It's the number of guns and the number of butter in tons. And I have just popped one into both of these, simply just to give you an example. So, and this is just a label, purchase amount. I'll show you how I set that up. So here we put in 1 gun and 1 ton of butter. Okay, so these are our decision variables. Down at the very bottom are our constraints. So we have really two constraints. The first constraint that we talked about, one of the constraints we talked about actually is storage. And remember, each gun takes a half cubic meter. Each ton of butter takes 1.5 cubic meters. The maximum we have is 21 cubic meters. I'll talk about used in a second. Costs are the second constraint that we have. Each gun costs $150 to produce. Each ton of butter costs $100 to produce. Okay? We have a maximum budget every month of $1,800. So we have to stay within that maximum. The revenue down here is just what we know we can sell these products for. And that's what we talked about early on when we talked about the decision variables. It's going to be when we take the number of guns and the number of tons of butter and we multiply it by each of the revenue levels, that is what feeds us this number up here, the 345. Okay. In this example, you'll see that I have 1 gun and I have 1 butter, or 1 ton of butter. And that's just to put a number in there. Those are certainly not maximized numbers, but our two decision variables have been set to 1. When I do that, I multiply 1 times my 0.05, and I also multiply 1 times 1.5, and that makes up my storage, and you'll see that 0.5 plus 1.5 equals 2. So this variable over here, this 2, is actually a sum of these two variables times these two variables, and that's how I get to 2. When I do the same thing for the costs, I see $150 and I see it $100. Multiply the 1 times 150, the 1 times 100, add it all together, and we get a total used of $250. Right now, we are well below our constraints because our used is well below 21, and our $250 used budget is well below the total budget of $1,800. So there's plenty of room to change these decision variables to come up with a much better maximized profit. Okay? We're also taking this number 1 and this number 1, and the 1 gets multiplied by 195. This one gets multiplied by 150. We add it all up together, and that's what populates this variable right there. That is our revenue that we get when we actually add in all of the numbers that we're looking at. Okay, that's kind of the sort of overview of the spreadsheet. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pop into Microsoft Excel right there. Okay, and I'll maximize the size of this a little bit so it's easier to see. I think I can do that. Maybe I can't. Nope, it's not going to let me. Okay, well, we'll have to deal with the size of it. All right, this is exactly the same spreadsheet that I was showing you in the PowerPoint. Revenue is our decision, or is our objective. Purchase amount is our decision variable, and then we have the constraints, storage and costs, and then the overall revenue that we'll use to actually calculate how much money we're making. Okay, so how did I set this up? All right, so the revenue, let's actually go to these decision variables first. Okay, these are just numbers that get entered in. And so right now I have just put a 1 in there. There are no formulas that have gone into the spreadsheet in that place. This is what the Solver tool in Microsoft Excel will maximize for us. So we'll tell Solver to take a look at these. Okay. Down here, these are just numbers that we popped in as well. They are numbers that were given to us by the problem. We know that our constraints are set and fixed, as is the case with 21 being the maximum storage space, $1,800 being the maximum budget, and this is the per gun or per ton of butter hit to each one of those, right? So when we have 1 gun, we know that we have to deduct 1/2 of the cubic meter from our 21 total. When we have 1 ton of butter, we know we have to deduct 1.5 cubic meters from our 21 cubic meter total. So that just helps us track that. All right, now we're going to get to something that's a little bit more complex, okay? And this is something using a formula in Microsoft Excel called sum product. Okay, this number, the 2, helps us understand where we are at when we've popped in certain decision variables. Okay? So sum product allows you to cross-multiply arrays. And if you're familiar with it, great. Probably the videos, I think the videos cover it, but we'll just take a look at really what we're doing here. So with sum product, we're taking what's in B4 and C4, these 2 numbers right here, and we're going to multiply it by what's in B7 and C7, right? So what it really does is it takes B4 and it multiplies it by B7 right there, and then it takes C4 and multiplies it by C7, and then it adds it all up, and that's what it pops over here. Okay? And that's what we see, right? 1 times 0.5, 1 times 1.5, add it all up, and you get 2. We did the same thing below. We did sum product. In this case, we did B4, C4, because that's our decision variables, and we multiplied it by the costs. So B4, in this case, B4 times B8 plus C4 times C8 gives us this value here, and that's how we use sum product. Okay. The last place that we use sum product is up at the top when we're doing revenue. Revenue is going to be sum product B4, again, B4 here, times B9. That's our revenue, right? And it'll also do the same thing, C4 times C9. It will add it all up, and that's what we put here. So that's our sum product to give us our revenue. So you can see that when we set this up this way, the only thing we really need to worry about changing are the decision variables, because the decision variables will cover everything else. So if we change these to 2, you'll see that we've got twice the storage, we've got twice the costs, we also have twice the revenue. Okay, we're still well within our constraints. Our constraint is 21 cubic meters and $1,800. So we're still within those constraints, but we wanted to take a look at what it would do when we just changed the decision variables. Okay, here's where Solver comes in. So Solver's going to come through, and we're going to tell it some pieces of information. First of all, we're going to tell it what are we maximizing. That is our objective right there. We're going to tell it what are the decision variables, and we're going to tell it what are the constraints? So how do we get to solver? If you've watched the videos, you know that you go to data, and you go all the way over to the right, and there's solver right there. And I've already put everything in. Well, sort of already put everything in. I'm actually going to take one of these constraints out to show you. Okay, to show you a couple of things. Okay, first thing we did is we said we wanted to maximize. What are we maximizing? We're maximizing cell B1. So, and the easiest way to do that is just to hit the arrow, go over and click on what you want, and then hit the other arrow, which is actually right there, and it just pops it into the solver tool for you. Okay, so we're going to maximize. We hit max on this. We're going to maximize this cell. Okay, and how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by changing the variable cells. Which ones do we want to change? These two right here, B4 and C4. Okay, it puts the dollar signs in there, and that's the persist. Those are the persistent ones, which basically means always be B4, C4, never change anything. It puts them in by default. We really don't need them, but it puts them in by default, so we'll just live with them. Okay, same thing. You can come, hit that, go over and check your, or select your two cells that you want, and then you hit the kind of import, and it pops it right into them. Okay, so we're done. Except we have to do our constraints. Okay, now the way we set this up, we said that our used space can never exceed our limit of the space. Okay, so that's great. Oh, we're still messing with this. Let me fix this. I should have not messed with this. C4, done. Okay. All right. I'll stop clicking on things. All right. So what we're saying, so you can see that here, right? We have column D and column E, and column E, whatever is in column E, has to be either less than or equal to whatever is in column D. So if we click on this one, when we want to actually enter these in, we can do the same kind of thing. We can just indicate that the cell reference that we're really concerned with is going to be E7. Okay, and E7 must be less than or equal to what we have in D7. Okay, and in this case, it's all set up already for us, but that's how we would set it up. We would do the same thing with what's in E8 and E7. So in that particular case, this one is, oh no, E8 and D8, yeah, E8, D8, I got the columns right. Okay, so this one has to remain less than $1,800. So, and that's what we've done here in this particular case. We say that whatever's in cell reference E8 has got to be less than or equal to D8. Okay, we're good to go there. And so everything's all set up. So when we got everything all set up, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to hit simplex LP. Simplex LP is going to be the algorithm that we use to solve this. There's a couple different options there. Simplex is the most common one, and I'm not going to go into the details of why we would pick this over the nonlinear or the evolutionary one. But select simplex and then go ahead and hit solver, and it will solve for you. And it gives us a certain number of guns and a certain number of butter, or a certain number of tons of butter. But we're running into a problem here, and we'll have to solve that. The problem that we run into is that we can't produce fractions of guns or fractions of butter, and that's what Solver has done for us. Is it's given us the absolute maximum profit. Up here we see a revenue of $2,597. It's given us the absolute maximum based on the production of 3.42 guns and 12.857 or 86 tons of butter. But we really have to produce whole units here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make one more constraint. And that constraint that we're going to make is going to be to sort of lock in some of our fields to be integers so that we can't get partial production. So we're going to go back to data and solver, and we're going to add one more constraint. And the constraint that we're going to add is we'll select the cells that we want. In that particular case, it's going to be these two cells, and we want them to be integers. So the operation that we use is going to be the int operation. It will default to integer on the constraint here, and we hit OK on that. We can resolve. Everything else is the same. And in this particular case, it gives us 4 guns and 12 tons of butter. And that turns out to be our optimal solution. You'll see that our profit dropped by $17, our maximum revenue dropped by $17 because we had to back off on some of the production. But in the reality, we got a good solution. We can produce 12 tons of butter. We can produce 4 guns each month. We'll make a profit of $2,580, which is great because that's more than we had before. But we also have costs and stuff that we have to account for. Of the space that we've used, we have 20 cubic meters of the 21 that's used, and we have maximized or used the entire amount of budget that we have. Okay, so that's the first part of your assignment is to replicate this spreadsheet. So you may want to actually run through this part of the video and set up your spreadsheet, or go back and show the part of the video that I showed you how to set the spreadsheet up and where to put the sum product and the like. That should all be fairly straightforward. But go ahead and set it up and work through the process of optimizing both your production of guns and butter, and then just replicate what you've got here. The second part is to change the equation a bit. And to change the equation a bit, you're going to have an additional amount of space that's used, and there's going to be some adjustments to some of the costs. And so you're going to produce this model again with those adjustments, and that's part 2. In the first part, you can save the spreadsheet to something called Butter 1 or Guns and Butter 1 or whatever I told you in the assignment. And then you'll save the other one to the same name with a 2 at the end of it, and turn both of those in as this week's assignment. If you have any questions, be sure to let your instructor know.